Very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that warm. I should have written that down. That's probably the most glowing recommendation anyone's ever made for me, Nick. So I might have you on my LinkedIn profile soon. But thank you for coming out and in such large numbers. It's a real pleasure for me to host. Last year, my role was usurped by the ever-brilliant Afua Hirsch, but I'm so glad she's on to bigger and better this year. So thank you, Afua, for your illustrious career, keeping some of us in employment. Yeah, so this year, as always, if you were to have read the framing of the conversation, there's something in it that sort of talks to the uncertainty and unpredictable nature of Africa, but perhaps that's everywhere in the world. And so our speakers will, in very broad strokes, because we have about an hour, little more than that, to cover 54 countries. So now I make the disclaimer to the Francophones and the one Sierra Leonean who will say, you never mention my country, that it is often very difficult, obviously, to give due credence to all countries of the African continent. But our speakers will try and do so, covering politics, economics, culture, and society, and really give you a sense of what their thinking is worth paying close attention to, and perhaps even better, how do we, who are outside of the continent, engage with the topics of discussion? I always feel like we have a conversation that many of us can't do anything about because we're analyzing and talking about spaces that we're not in. So often it's wonderful to think about what role we can play here, whether it's in how we talk about the issues or tweet about them, or indeed how we use our civil society power or money or anything else. The Nigerian elections are coming up, as are elections in South Africa later this year. I was having a quick scan of the news, and it turns out that almost 1 million new voters have registered already in South Africa, 80% of them under 30. So obviously we will talk about how youth might play a part in shifting the dynamics of the continent. But you didn't come to listen to me. You came to hear Kumi Naidu speak. You came to hear Nanjala Nyabola speak, Razia Khan, and Patrick Sam. What do these people do? One of these pieces of paper should tell me. Kumi is the Secretary General of Amnesty International. Nanjala is a writer and independent political analyst from Kenya. As you have heard, she has a book launch here in a few days. Razia is Chief Economist for Africa and the Middle East at Standard Chartered. And last but not least, Patrick is the chairperson of the National Arts Council of Namibia. So please welcome them all very warmly. Okay, here's what you need to know about how our discussion will run. Each of our speakers, in the order I've introduced them, will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes just to set out their stall, covering some top-line issues. And then I will get first dibs as chair to ask them some questions, and then we will open it out to the floor. So without any further ado, Kumi, over to you.
Thank you, Elisa. Good evening, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Hello? Sorry. Good evening, everybody. Let me start by saying that the moment of history that we are in, we could characterize what we saw in 2018 in Africa and what we continue to observe in 2019 as Africa's third struggle for freedom. Our first struggle was to end colonialism, and then came the second struggle, which was to deal with one-party states, dictatorial regimes, the absence of any semblance of a rule of law, and to struggle for constitutionalism. Now, that struggle is not complete, far from it. However, in the last decade, we've seen the start of the third struggle, which is to ensure that our inherent human rights and states' obligations to protect, promote, and fulfill them are boldly enshrined in our regional human rights treaties, including the African People's Commission for Human Rights. But as we well know, that these formal things are actually largely, many of our governments pay lip service to it. The struggle we are in now is about ensuring these laws and human rights commitments worth more than just what is written on paper. And it is a fierce struggle going on right now on the continent, mostly led by young people and with a growing number of women showing visibility in many, many of the movements that we are seeing that are rising up from Sudan to DRC and elsewhere. In 2018, sadly, we saw this continued pattern of brutal repression and crackdown across the region, particularly targeting peaceful protesters, journalists, activists, and human rights defenders. The examples are too many to cover all of them, but just to name check a few. In Zambia, for example, we saw trumped-up charges against a rapper who was challenging exorbitant government spending. Journalists in Mozambique have had to live with prohibitively expensive accreditation fees, as well as kidnappings and beatings. In West and Central Africa, prominent pro-democracy activists, bloggers, anti-slavery campaigners, and peaceful protesters from Burkina Faso, from Cameroon, Niger, Sierra Leone, Togo, and Mauritania were met with arbitrary detentions, restrictions, beatings, arrests, prosecutions, and even enforced disappearances. Similar trends observed elsewhere in the East and Great Lakes region, including renewed attacks on freedom of expression in Uganda via a social media tax, unabated crackdown on dissent and free media in Eritrea, arbitrary arrests of human rights defenders in South Sudan and Sudan, and widespread crackdown on peaceful protests and imprisonment of pro-democracy activists like members of the Filimbi citizens movement in DRC. Now, at least there is some good news that I can share, and that we have had two countries where I think we've had some positive movement in a positive direction in the last year. One is Ethiopia. Anybody from Ethiopia here? Okay, cool. I have to check now because I don't want to be too enthusiastic because, there are times that we've been too enthusiastic when good things happen and then our leaders betray us. But I think what's happened in Ethiopia is something worth celebrating. Thousands of people, were released from detention in the first half of 2018 following a political change, including a renowned journalist who was in prison since 2011 on trumped-up terrorism charges, Eskinda Nega. The new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, has ushered in several reforms, including lifting the ban on political parties, initiating reform of repressive laws, and removing arbitrary restrictions on websites and online media groups. We also have some positive movements in Angola. In the post-Dos Santos era, we have witnessed incremental and unprecedented step towards tackling endemic corruption and contributes to the denial of basic socioeconomic rights of citizens, including going after the former president's family and close cronies. Now, when we look at the third struggle for freedom in 2019, sadly, we can see that there are a range of explosive conflicts, I would say, on the continent right now, in particular in DRC, in Zimbabwe, and Sudan. But all three of those conflicts, there are differences amongst them, but what you see is extreme economic deprivation driving anger and resistance. So both with Zimbabwe and Sudan, it was related to significant rise in fuel prices and food prices. So I thought I would end by saying that within this context, what is happening on a positive front? I should say, sadly, one more negative thing. Today, Transparency International brought up its corruption index, and Africa is still on the top. We are leading the corruption stakes, not the anti-corruption stakes. And an interesting trend to look at in Africa, the countries that are doing best in terms of addressing anti-corruption tend to be the small countries on the continent. So it's Seychelles, it's Cape Verde, it's Botswana, who has a representative on the panel, Mauritius and so on. Sadly, this is not multiplying as we would like. I would like to conclude by saying, though, that what is happening positively on the continent is that we are seeing new energies emerging in terms of resistance to corruption, injustice, and so on. We are seeing new forms of organizing, which are quite different from what we learned during the anti-colonial struggles or what the NGO community has largely been doing. So we see, for example, in Senegal, a youth cultural movement called Yanama that's really captured imagination. In South Africa, we had Fees Must Fall that fought hard and won free university education for people who cannot afford it, and so on. But I would like to just end with this substantive point, that if Africa is to move forward as a continent, we must recognize that individual African countries cannot do it alone. I'm going to say something that's very unpopular. Most of the nation states on the African continent, in terms of the boundaries that was given to us by European colonialism, does not make economic, cultural, linguistic, environmental, or any other sense. And if Africans are serious about picking our people up from the bondage that they find themselves, and to not ensure that we continue to have not even 1% who are benefiting, but 0.5% that are benefiting at a massive level, then we have to bring back into our conversations the need for Pan-Africanism, right? And I'm happy to say that there are movements that are doing this well. Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity, a social movement that emerged around, with the declaration called Kilimanjaro Declarations. To the Africans in the audience and those in the diaspora, I encourage you to go and visit the Africans Rising website. By the way, it's Africans Rising, not Africa Rising, because we've been hearing about Africa Rising. It's only GDP rising, the people are sinking, right? And so I would say very strongly that if Africans are serious about moving our people on the continent forward, we have to work beyond the nation-state boundaries that was given to us by colonialism. Since Europe adopted the euro, I've been jokingly saying that if Europe can have a euro, I don't see why Africa can't have an afro. And I'm not talking about the beautiful hairstyle that I see evidence of in this room. But I would conclude by saying that governments on our continent must recognize that the use of repression and force is not a statement of your strength, it is a statement of your weakness. And young people who are in large numbers on the continent are saying, we will not accept it. And I think political leaders who are very old and a continent that's very young, and that clash is going to explode if our leaders don't listen to young people on the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kumi. Najala, over to you. Please model in the timekeeping ways that Kumi has demonstrated very aptly.
I rarely get told that I model timekeeping, but thank you.
I'll do my best. So I guess I'm building off a lot of the things that Kumi has talked about, and I wanted to talk about three things. One is elections and the changing nature of elections on the continent, which is going to be a big issue. We have a lot of elections coming up in the following year. You mentioned South Africa and Nigeria, but Senegal also has a presidential election coming up. Guinea-Bissau has one, Algeria has one, Malawi has one, Mozambique has a legislative election, I believe. Tunisia has a presidential election coming up. So there's going to be a lot of elections coming. Namibia as well. We always forget Namibia. We were talking about this before. Namibia has a presidential election coming up. So these are things that the changing nature of elections is something that's really interesting to me. And I started last year by writing an essay for African Arguments on what I'm calling the Stability Doctrine, which is basically that, look, the West isn't coming anymore. That thing is over. That thing where we send people to the State Department to go and negotiate, or we send people to the Foreign Commonwealth Office and say, can you come and do something in the DRC. And the DRC is a great example of this, that people have chosen, because economic interests are increasingly more important than social and political interests, the fact is the stability of the African state is going to increasingly take precedence over the well-being of African people. So we have to decide, as Kumi was saying, we have to decide for ourselves as African people what we want our countries and our continents to look like, because, and I say this again, the West isn't coming. Nobody's coming to help you. Nobody's coming to help us. We have to figure this out on our own. You only have to look at the Central African Republic. You only have to look at South Sudan. You only have to look at the DRC. You only have to look at Cameroon. You only have to look at, there's a growing list of countries where we're seeing that the premises on which international interventions were based on, which is that we are going to have normative interventions originating in Washington, D.C., originating in Brussels, originating in London, that doesn't make sense anymore. And if we don't have a conversation about self-determination and a conversation about what kind of states we actually want to live in, we're going to end up in a great deal of trouble. Tied into that is the concept of the changing nature of elections. And this stems, again, from the work that I've done in Kenya, but looking at Nigeria and looking at South Africa, what we've seen is two things. Number one, private foreign corporations have a great interest in African elections because it allows them to secure their financial interests on the continent. And what does that mean? That means Cambridge Analytica. That means private PR firms that are being paid to spin narratives of non-functional governments that have deep pockets paying British, American, French PR firms to sanitize their reputations both in Africa and abroad. And so you have, Paul Biya paying a French company or Ali Bongo, who has not been in the country for almost 3 months, paying a French PR company to talk about how his good leadership is guiding Gabon into a bright future, when in actual fact, Gabon is on the verge of collapse. So that's one thing, the fact that there is money to be made in African elections and the fact that there are these foreign interests. We're going to see an increasing amount of foreign interest, and it's important to pay attention to this because, for example, the interference of private companies like Cambridge Analytica was to play on ethnic hatreds and to play on religious hatreds that were already present within these various societies. What happens when money exacerbates tensions in African countries for profit? This is a question that we're seriously going to have to grapple with because right now, as I said, private commercial interests are trumping the welfare and well-being of African people. And the second thing, as I said, is stability. And again, the DRC is a great example of this, but I was just in Madagascar at the beginning of this year, and I saw this up close, is the fact that regardless of the problems that we're seeing in African elections, they're no longer, and this is not an African problem, I think this is a global problem, that elections are not necessarily about what we say that they're about. Are we voting to get leaders? Are we voting to get political guidance? Or are we going through the motions of the process of confirming what are essentially fiefdoms, a wealthy, moneyed class that perpetuates itself through the political system? Is that what we're doing here? That there's actually no change. It's in the UK, it's a bunch of Oxbridge. I can say that I went to Oxford. Oxbridge people rotating chairmanship of the UK. Is a bunch of elite people in Kenya rotating chairmanship of the country. And we're using elections in order to rubber stamp that lack of change at the top. So that's the question, another question I think we're going to have to think about in 2019. The next thing I want to point out is the money's going to run out. And we've already seen this in Zimbabwe. We've seen it in Sudan. What will happen to many of the countries that have over-leveraged themselves with debt and overexposed themselves to massive white elephant infrastructure projects, and that many of these loans, especially to China, but also, let's not be hypocritical about this. There are also loans that have been taken with the World Bank, with the IMF, with other, Western institutions. What's going to happen when the money runs out? In Zimbabwe, are there any Zimbabweans in the room? Hi, you're all by yourself. So, Zimbabwe is an interesting one because right now in Zimbabwe, there are 5 different monetary systems operating in parallel that the Zimbabwean government cannot afford to pay and so keeps inventing new currencies or new forms of exchange, mediums of exchange, in order to keep the economy going. And the violence that we've seen in Zimbabwe over the last month is really a product of, people say it's about petrol prices, but really it is fundamentally about a society that has been, the government has overexposed itself, cannot afford to keep the country running, and is punishing citizens for its own mismanagement. This is what's happening in Sudan as well, to some extent, is that the petrol lines in Sudan don't make the news because Sudan happens to be an Arabic-speaking country. But the petrol queues in Zimbabwe, in Khartoum, are just as long as the ones in Harare, were just as long as the ones in Harare. And it was arbitrary price rises whereby the government has run out of money and is trying to literally siphon it from the people in order to service its debts and maintain that kind of economic, I don't know, it doesn't make any sense in terms of what they're trying to do. These two countries are the extremes that we're thinking about right now. I think we're going to see more of this. And I say this because of my own country, which is overexposed to China. We have a gently used railway system that we didn't need and we can't afford to pay for. And Kenya is right now scrambling to raise money to service its debts. And I think that I can tell you the economic fundamentals of Kenya right now don't make much sense, and we're really just waiting for what the next debt crisis is going to look like, what's going to be hit the hardest. And I'll be curious to see how this plays out. So what's going to happen when the money runs out? But I will end like Kumi, and I'll take Kumi's lead and try and end on a positive note. One trend that is really interesting to me is the rise of networked protests across Africa, which is not just that Ugandans are protesting for the release of Bobi Wine, but that people in Kenya, the largest amount of agitation for the release of Bobi Wine happened in Kenya. That the largest amount of agitation for Filimbi or Lucha RDC is coming from Senegal, is coming from Burkina Faso. That we're seeing a lot of this technology spurring a new wave of Pan-Africanism that I think is really inspiring. We're seeing all kinds of, and especially feminist networks arising, and people going to DRC to talk about what feminism in Africa should look like moving forward. I think the rise of networked protests is going to lead to what Kumi is alluding to, a new conversation about what it means to be African. Who gets to decide what is African tradition, what is African behavior, what is African identity. And, we talk about, I used to be very shocked and say, Kenya is, 60% of Kenya is under the age of 35. Oh my God, that is shocking. And then you learn that 60% of Cameroon is under the age of 25. And in Uganda and all of these other countries with youth skewing demographics, I think people have a sense of transition and wanting to see things go differently, and we're learning across borders and having these conversations across borders, and I think that's going to be a very interesting thing moving forward. So, who are we? The struggle to define ourselves, to define African, to define Pan-Africanism, I think is also going to be an interesting thing to watch out for.
Brilliant, thank you. We have set you all a big challenge, speakers, too. So thank you for trying to keep to time. Razia, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to start off by thinking about one of the lines in Nanjala's book, where I thought, as an economist, this is something we really need to give greater thought to. And the line that really struck me was where she says, look, it's not about Africa rising or Africa falling. Sometimes we just need to accept that Africa's being. It just is. And I'm always conscious that when we start one of these outlook sessions talking about what lies ahead in the year, are we going to be very bullish? Are we going to say, yes, growth returns to Africa? Are we going to be bearish? Is it even possible to generalize over so many different countries in any meaningful way? What do we make of the outlook for 2019? What is perplexing a lot of people who work in financial markets right now is that last year, everyone felt, for the most part, pretty good about global growth. There had been recovery from the global financial crisis. A lot of the major economies were showing signs of growing again. The US was growing as well, despite the fact that that economic expansion has been going for a number of years now. And even despite this, financial markets didn't necessarily do that well. Some say, well, maybe it was the pricing in of political risk. Maybe everyone could see the shocks on the horizon, trade tensions that would be really bad for everyone. Brexit, do we even know what lies in store? Maybe on the other side of tonight we'll have a better idea. But lots of things to worry about. And the question is, well, what is it going to mean for Africa? At the start of this year, we know that there was a great deal more gloom about global prospects. There is this tendency to think, oh no, China's slowing. We don't know if we can make a lot of sense out of the growth numbers. Trade tensions, even if we have a benign outcome, let's really watch for a world that looks very different going forward. And poor Africa, Africa being left behind. Growth recently hasn't been that good. Is there any likelihood of a recovery? People have lost sight of the possibility that the Nigerian economy can grow at a very robust rate again. South Africa, there was all of this euphoria about the Ramaphosa presidency, and the economy went into a technical recession. How do you explain that? If we were to characterize what we do expect this year, it's that despite some of that global gloom and doom, we do think the growth comes back to Africa. One point I would emphasize is that what happens in Africa has always been fundamentally driven by developments in the region itself. So if we're looking at the growth, we can't ignore the demographics of the region. They might look frightening from a stability perspective. From a growth perspective, it's not necessarily such a bad thing, so long as all of those resources can be put to productive use. And there are lots of different variables, of course, that are going to influence that. Does the global economy matter? Of course it does. So many of the economies in the region are still very commodity dependent. If we were to see a slump in commodity prices for any reason, this will necessarily impact growth in the region. But how do we see things in 2019? Many of Africa's key economies are actually recovering from that earlier commodity price slump, the oil price slump of 2014. This is a process that runs with a lag. It takes a while before the growth comes back. We know that there needed to be an adjustment. We know that many of the oil-producing economies were cutting their budgets very sharply, that this necessarily had an impact, that slowly feeds through into everything else. But we do think we can be confident in saying growth is in sight of the region again. We shouldn't ignore those important instances of positive political change. People are looking at Ethiopia, the opening up there, the unexpected pace of reform in Angola, thinking it's not just South Africa that is in sight of being able to build on the progress, build on the reform, maybe embrace greater transparency with better outcomes for consumer-driven growth. The challenges are also going to be significant. If we had been talking about the outlook a few years ago, there would have been lots of warnings about 2019. 2019 brings us closer to that crunch point. From 2022 on, about 10 years on from that explosion of external debt issuance in African economies, we're going to see a lot more of that Eurobond debt, the debt that was a lot cheaper for African economies to take on. Suddenly, it all starts maturing in one go. Should we be afraid of another debt crisis in Africa? Unlike Nanjala, I don't believe the money is going to run out. Maybe because I'm a banker and we can create some of the money. But it's true that the region is going to be facing greater issues around debt sustainability. And very quickly on this point, there's going to be a greater challenge in terms of the ability of countries to refinance the debt that is maturing. For countries that still have a very good growth profile, who can keep going back to investors, who can say we have debt maturing, but actually we also have the ability to borrow again, things are not going to be that bad. Within the franc zone, the CFA franc zone, especially amongst the oil-producing countries, many more countries started to sign up to IMF programs, simply to prove that they were creditworthy, that they could put in place the reforms, that they would be able to refinance the debt more comfortably. What we're learning very rapidly is that perhaps it's the debt that we didn't know about that is problematic. So it's not so much everything that has been visible, that's traded, everyone expects it, anticipated. It's when suddenly we come to terms with the fact that there has been borrowing that we didn't know about, or in terms that we didn't understand. And this is where the call for transparency is important, because if there's going to be this continuous process of economic growth, continuous progress, a lot of infrastructure building, which the region does need, the infrastructure deficit is significant. No African businesses started the year saying, let's talk about this continental free trade area. Let's talk about the opportunities that could result from that. Why? Infrastructure is possibly one amongst many different reasons. But if we are going to see Africa overcoming these challenges, the sustaining of perhaps a new growth path, the resumption, the economic recovery, more growth, a better quality of growth, then it's all important that the building blocks are in place. So transparency, knowing the situation of different countries, and of course, a lot of the reforms that were spoken about by the previous speakers.
Fantastic. Patrick. We're overwhelmed with good information. We could do a panel with each of you, but let's take us to the arts, please.
Thank you, Razia, everybody. I think it was a great introduction. Where I want to take off from is this idea of Africa being, and what that means in terms of our beings. Because in summation of what you guys are saying, what we need to acknowledge is that, as a country like Namibia that's never known, every politician always answers you, because I also work on TV, and they'll be like, so how far have we come? And they'll say, it's not as bad as it used to be, but we're also not quite where we want to be, right? So there's this innate deficit that exists, and I think the first acknowledgement is around the idea of democratic deficit that exists on the continent, right? So there has been acknowledgement in terms of some of the gains, especially when it comes to opportunities of access, mobility. When you're talking about Africans rising, I mean, look at us here, the level of wealth, knowledge that exists here is kind of manifesting the story. And I want to take it back as somebody who deals with culture, somebody who deals with the arts, and is making a very strong statement about the viability of this as a possible pillar for this demographic dividend that you're speaking about, the fact that more than half of African countries' populations are younger than 25. So what does that really mean? So getting back to kind of this historical capture, I want to read a quote from a British parliamentarian in 1835 who goes to Africa and comes back from there, and it's about 183 years ago, around the same time, on the 2nd of February, just to kind of embed it in how intentional the state that we find ourselves in has been. And he comes back to British Parliament, and excuse my acting here, and he says his name is Lord Mackellar, and he goes, I can imagine him standing there, it's a very feisty place in Britain. And he says, it's happening tonight as well. So he comes back and he says, I've traveled across the length and breadth of Africa. I've not seen one person who's a beggar, who's a thief. Such wealth I've seen in this country, such high moral values, people of such caliber, that I do not think we would ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and her cultural heritage. And therefore, I propose that we replace her old and ancient education system, her culture. For if the Africans think that all that is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they'll become what we want them, a truly dominated nation. Now, fast forward 183 years. There is this idea of duality that has to be confronted, because we do have a dissonance around what we are able to do as people and what we're not able to do as people. So in the aspect of duality, when we do recognize aspects of things like spirituality and how that's manifested through the arts and culture and speaking about that, is the very fact of why that statement's not true. The Africans are still spirited. But now the question is, we have a car, but you're not giving us fuel. Where do I go with a car without fuel? And what do we need to fuel, I think, has been covered well here. And I want to look at how we as human beings, beyond just being Africans, position ourselves. And I think it's an important clash, because there's almost like, people talked about the clash of civilization, we've deconstructed that. But in decolonizing the systems that existed, there is a paradox that exists. So on the one hand, kind of like natural elements, whether you look at wind, water, fire, earth. There is this aspect that fire can burn you or warm you, right? So at what intensity and what frequency does that happen? If somebody talks to you, water, water, you're alive. When I drink you, you quench me, you know? And then somebody says, but water, you drowned my child last week. Water's like, what are you talking about? I don't talk about that. What you focusing on, right? But the ultimate truth is that there is this duality that exists, and this duality exists about Africa, and this duality exists about this intersection that we're going through, where we can have this spirit and sing and talk and overcome and have a sense of resilience that will carry us through. That's why Africans are rising, and at the same time, we have these institutional, structural, systemic issues that are manifested through things like greed and just habit. The biggest obstacle to change is just the system is in a habit of exploiting the African body, exploiting the African land, exploiting the African experience, but at the same time, the African being can overcome this. So there is a greater spiritual connection to this. So another question is, how do we kind of monetize this? You know, how do we ensure this access?
No one saw that coming. How do I get rich now?
I mean, we have this duality of young people where I read the quote, is Africa's population has been on the increase over the past 50 years. The continent is home to 1.2 billion people, over 60% of whom fall under the age of 25. The population of Africa is projected to be double by 2050 to around 2.4 billion people. By 2100, the growth rate, 80% is going to be Africans. Now, is that an opportunity? Is that a threat? It's both. Now, what do we feed? You know, Native American child goes to his grandfather, and it's like, there's two wolves fighting in me, you know, the good and the bad, the intersection, who's going to win? And he says, the one that you feed. So what are we going to feed? I say we feed your art and culture. Because art and culture ultimately deals with the intellectual, emotional, and spiritual well-being of people. Now, if we have a historical capture and elite capture, we have to decolonize. We have to decolonize the system. So the challenges that I've identified, and I think it's widely identified, is around the existence of human frailty. Fragility is a thing. How do we develop resilience in our communities? And I think Africa has a large part to tell you, how do you survive on $1 a day? You know, when you're questioning the future of the well-being of people, beyond just creating employment, it's important. So when we're looking at, for instance, our economy and access to resources, ownership is a key factor. Right? That's where the question of land in South Africa is big. In Namibia, it's big. Because ultimately, as Africans, we're based on the principle of collective, inclusive land ownership. Through colonialism, that theory gets deconstructed by individual, exclusive land ownership. How do we decolonize that? How do we get back to the principles that kept us spirited, that kept us alive? Right? When we talk about society, well-being beyond employment creation, I think is a big, important discussion that we need to have. So in rounding up, I think human frailty needs to be discussed. Institutional failures, the arrangements need to be changed. Obsessions with false theories about who we are as African people. When we're looking at our cultural goods, there was a UNESCO report that talks about, we in terms of our cultural trade, it's less than 1% in the world. North America, Europe have about 69% of it. Why? Because we have an inferiority complex around it. That's why I made sure I'm wearing a Namibian designer tonight, just to show you guys how fashionable it is. So I'll keep it there for now. So I'll keep it there for now. But my point is the creative industry is the viable solution because it is the cheapest option to create employment. I'm saying right now that people already have the intellectual property. Let's copyright it. Let's take it to scale. Let's market it and ensure that we can sustain the industry because it employs 30 million people and it's worth about $2.2 billion. But Africa only has 1%.
Patrick, I think after that, no one is forgetting Namibia anytime soon. Okay, I'm loath, there's so many different directions we could go, and we know that in real life, none of these things in any household, in any human being's body are separate. That their culture and financial and societal and religious, all of these things are embodied in the person, but I'm going to have to try and ask each of you a separate question to try and move the discussion forward, and then hopefully open up very quickly to the floor. Kumi, there was so much, like with all of you, that you said that was really brilliant and really impactful, and I was thinking about this idea of creating a new Pan-Africanism and really power, because you have spent probably all of your career identifying where power is and trying to take that power for communities. Would you agree with that statement, or to shift power?
Yeah, I'll agree that I've been doing it somewhat unsuccessfully.
Good. Okay, you're a failed power shifter, but that's okay. You're the only one we've got. So I was thinking about the idea that it's actually becoming harder for people to see where power resides. And that actually, when you were talking about the use of force as actually a sign of weakness, that is true. So if you're looking at the next generation of activists, all these young people who are trying to move power and they can't identify where power is, where do they start? Because we need to be able to find out who holds power to then be able to crest it from them and share it.
Well, one of the things about the moment of history we find ourselves, not only in Africa, but globally, is that people are finding out that actually it's quite easy to capture power. It is much harder to use that power, and it's much easier to lose that power, right? Think Trump, for example, right? Or think Bolsonaro, or think, okay, you can think about
but
European
do these
characters,
individuals
right?
really have the power?
So that's what's going to come. And importantly, if you look at the Conservative Party in the UK, 33% of a mandate is maximum that they get. If you look at the first past the post system, Bolsonaro the same, Modi the same. You can go and so right now, real power is actually, I would say, not being exercised, because far too many people have said that kind of power I don't want, or it's too rotten, or it's too corrupt. And it's a real challenge for civil society activism, because on the one hand, while we recognize that people have legitimate reasons to be disillusioned with the way elections and power dynamics play in governance, and for that reason, sometimes people are withdrawing from public spaces and choosing not to vote, for example. And while you can understand that, because of the defectiveness of elections and so on, it's important that we still struggle, I think, to try to make those election systems as meaningful and transparent and as fair. Now, the other thing when we're thinking about power is we should not think about it only in terms of the state, right? We have to think about what power do we have to address the challenges that humanity faces. And one word that would be, one challenge that would be wrong for us as a panel not to put on the table is the question of climate change. I mean, Africa as a continent, right, has been least responsible for carbon emissions, but Africa as a continent is paying the first and most brutal price. I should say, though, as an admission, South Africa, my country, is a big culprit. It's the 14th largest emitter in the world. But if you remove South Africa out of it, Africa as a continent has contributed marginally, historically, to emissions. So in thinking about how we actually use creative power, I think I've just come from Davos, where I've been talking to various governments from the continent and so on. So for example, speaking about climate change, I said, we are waiting as a continent for what solar technology, renewable technology, other technologies, others will build, and we'll be in the same position where we'll be victims of dumping of intellectual property and so on, whereas we, as a continent blessed with lots of sun, should be thinking about, and lots of renewable possibilities, should be thinking about how do we turn that power to be able to play, and we should be investing in our universities and in developing the kind of ways forward. So you might find this a bit offensive. I'll give you an early warning. So I've been saying to some of our leaders, for example, see, there are many European cities, for example, right? Uppsala, Bristol, Uppsala in Sweden, Bristol, that run their buses, for example, on human feces, otherwise known as shit, crap, whatever, right? So I've been saying to our leaders, listen, if Bristol and Uppsala and other European cities can run their buses on human shit, I refuse to believe African shit is inferior to European shit. We just have to get our shit together and turn the crisis of climate change into an opportunity. Because, sorry, I'm saying this half tongue in cheek, but basically, when the climate scientists tell us, and for Amnesty International, this, climate change is a fundamental human rights issue. Because the climate scientists told us just over 2 months ago that we get 12 years to get emissions to peak and start coming down. We should be panicked. We should be like, how do we go into an emergency mode? Because 12 years is like nothing, right? And so when we're thinking about power right now, the last thing to close in, I think we must learn something from the feminist movement that we should, that we've refused to learn, and that is when the feminist movement argued decades ago to advance gender equality, we need intersectionality, right? Okay, it's a rather cumbersome word, but a very powerful concept, that we needed to understand how, for example, gender interacts with race, class, ability, and so on. And I think that's the missing ingredient in terms of how African civil society is trying to harness power. We make the same mistakes as government, where we operate in silos and divisions and brands and logos and so on. Folks, we are fighting now for the survival of this, not the planet, by the way. But I just want to clarify the planet is in absolutely good shape. Seriously. Because if we continue on the path we are on, what will happen? We warm up the planet to the point where our water resources go, as we are seeing in Namibia and elsewhere. We destroy our soil, as we're seeing in North Africa, parts of East Africa, the Horn, and so on. Part of the driver of European migration through the Mediterranean. And the end result is we'll be gone, but the planet will still be. And the good news is once we become extinct as a species, the forests will grow back, the oceans will recover, and so on. So be very clear that the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is whether humanity can fashion a way to coexist with nature in a mutually interdependent relationship for centuries and centuries to come. Put differently, the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is nothing more and nothing less about protecting our children and their children's futures. And for the African people as a whole, it is a terrible, terrible injustice that even though most of our people have hardly contributed to the problem, do not have televisions, do not have fridges, do not have the kinds of things that many of us take for granted, but they are paying the first and most brutal price. And we need to connect the different agendas if we're going to maximize our power to get our leaders to either do the right thing or get out of the way. Because as a young man in Nairobi said recently to Winnie, the head of Oxfam, he said, we are the youngest continent in the world in terms of demography, with the oldest leaders. And she said that to Museveni in Davos, and he wasn't very happy about it.
Nanjala, you as well said so many things that we could touch on. It was so true that when we were looking at the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, so little of the analysis was about how does this play out in Africa, where just 5 years ago there was a whole drive for Facebook Zero, and where Africans could only access the internet through Facebook. And so if you are limited to just this one platform, what does that mean in terms of your data, how you access information, how you interact in the world, etc.? But I won't ask you that question. I'll ask you instead about automation, because we have spoken about the role technology plays, and we are talking about Africa's development as if African people remain at the center of that growth, whether it is as farm labor or working in the textile factories in Ethiopia. But if we're going to see a rise in automation, then we will have what I've heard described as a growing useless class. And so then, therefore, no longer needed by the elites, no longer needed by the corporations, because actually you can still hit the GDP by using machinery or AI. What is that going to mean as far as you understand it? And please, panelists, do feel to jump in from your perspectives also about what that means in terms of our political systems, our economic systems, when we have AI and a growing useless class.
Nice, easy question.
Yeah, just in 5 seconds.
In
please.
5 seconds. I think I saw in a World Bank report on employment and labor in Kenya from 2017 that there are over 20,000 young people employed as security guards in Kenya. And security is I used to be a security guard, so this is one of the many things I did to help pay for my university education. And I can tell you it's a big waste of human capital, because you are literally just sitting there for 12 hours a day. Someone comes in, you stop them from bringing a bottle of water in. You occasionally invade someone's privacy, pat them down. But it is really a waste. It's not an intellectual pursuit. You're not making anything. You're just sitting there. And this was a conversation that was triggered by this idea of a useless class, because really what happens, and the other country that you see this a lot is in South Africa. The security industry is basically about siphoning relatively well-educated young people and using them as a barrier between power, rich, wealthy people, and ordinary people. And I can say this without fear of contradiction. Security guards, it's one of the worst jobs in the world. There was a day that I arrived in Johannesburg and a money truck, what are they called? You know, the ones that carry money around from banks. The airport had been blown up on the highway so that they could steal the money, and they didn't steal the money, they just ended up killing a bunch of security guards. So it is really, when you think about the risk-return ratio, rewards, whatever, it's really, and you're earning $80 a month, it doesn't make sense as an employment industry. It's one of the fastest growing industries in Kenya. Why? Because the gap between the rich and the poor is rising, and rich people need more people to stand between their wealth and the people and poor people. Demonization, criminalization of poverty, the fact that police in Kenya can kill young men almost arbitrarily, young poor men for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, arbitrarily, whereas rich people who steal from the government get 1 year to cool off and then come back as deputy prime minister or deputy president. Don't quote me on that. So I think what we're going to see, and this is what Razia was saying about, or Razia and Patrick, I think, both said this in different ways. Which wolf are you going to feed? And I love what you said about the creative industry, Patrick, because it is one area where we do have a high degree of control, we have a high degree of agency in. And it's the one area that we are stifling. You know, I think of my own country, Kenya, it's one of the sectors that is actually being strangled. You know, you think about Kenyan athletes. What do you need to be a marathon runner? To practice and train every day and to have that determination. You don't need a great deal. You need maybe kit and things like that. The Ministry of Tourism, Sports Tourism and Culture stole so much money from Kenya's Olympic team in 2016 that people didn't have kit. They actually were staying in a barrio in Rio. They were videos of them having lunch, sitting around a drum outside, standing around really, while gunshots were going off in the background because someone had taken the money that was supposed to go towards their accommodation and given it to their girlfriends. So we have to ask fundamental questions about, are we ready for what's coming? I think with the idea of manufacturing as being the backbone towards economic development, automation then becomes a real issue. So we have export processing zones, we have these, cut flowers. These are the pillars of Kenya's economy, with the exception of tourism. A lot of these jobs aren't going to be necessary, in the next 20 years. What are we doing in the alternative? Are we actually investing in industries where we have a unique addition that we can bring to the table? And are people interested in those initiatives? Because the other part of it is people have to consume what the creatives are producing in order for it to be, it's about breaking the hegemony of Western culture. And we'd like to hold up Nollywood as a great example of this, of people saying we're going to actually do it our way. And now we're seeing the most popular form of entertainment in Kenya on television is Nollywood. But it is. And so these are the kind of things that we're going to have to think about.
You don't want to make enemies out of Nigeria.
No, I love Nigeria.
Let me stop you while you're
Nigerian
ahead.
jollof. Yeah. I wanted to say one thing to something that Kumi said. This is something that was brought up last week, which is that Africa today contributes. It was an AFP report that said that Africa today contributes the smallest market for the global arms trade, but that they are hoping to grow it over the next few years, and there's going to be a significant investment in expanding the arms trade in Africa, and Russia is looking to expand, and South Africa is, selling weapons. And I looked at this whole thing, and do you ever feel like your skin is actually crawling? Like you're like, what's wrong with you people? What's wrong with you? Because what are you saying fundamentally? We're going to put more guns into the hands of children, because it is children, right? And tell them to go off and kill each other so we can make a quick buck. I think we also have to start asking fundamental ethical questions about what the West is doing and what we in this room, well, you, are feeding into. And that means starting to pay attention to what your governments and what your private corporations are flying halfway around the world to promote. Because this was being reported as a normal economic story. It was like, the price of bread. Oh, and by the way, let's sell some more AK-47s to South Sudan. South Sudan spends more on its military-industrial complex than it does on food. Kenya spends more on defense than, the only thing that Kenya spends more on than defense is education, and that is because of the number of people who are in Kenyan schools. It's not because of the per capita spend. Why it was the first thing that Donald Trump did when he came into office, the first agreement that he signed with Kenya was a sale, $14 million fighter jets with Kenya, which cannot afford to pay for free education. I think that's also something that we have to start asking ourselves, which is the culpability of our corporations, our individuals, and our governments towards creating some of the problems that we're talking about today.
It's very difficult to be a moderator of brilliant Africans because, when I do this in other spaces, the European will blush and then quickly, mid-sentence, stop what they're saying, and then the African gives me a thumbs up and proceeds to talk for another 10 minutes. I don't know what to do, people. I'm just like, no, you are in a row. And it's brilliant. It's all brilliant. But I have the distasteful job of cutting you off because I wanted, perhaps first, Razia to come in from an economic perspective on this idea of a growing useless class, whether or not African economists are prepared for that as they sort of plan ahead, and international corporations, of course, that are working on the continent. And then I had also wanted to ask you about the word that we haven't. We've managed to talk about economics and systems and eschewed the mention of the word capitalism. And so I'm going to ask you the question that I got really lambasted for asking Masters in Public Arts students at the University of Oxford, which is if Africa can leapfrog the the landline, and if we're forming networks and using technology, isn't it possible that we might possibly leapfrog capitalism too, given what we have seen about how, as an economic system, it's built on the back, it's basically dependent on exploitation to maximize growth, and that trickle-down really doesn't work. So tell us about who is preaching in economic spaces alternative economic models. I've never yet heard an African company talk about, we're going to put Ubuntu at the center of our business model. We have totally embodied the Western model of build corporate and then do good, open a school for the blind.
You weren't going to ask any easy questions.
We don't have enough time for easy questions. We've got 12 years left.
Maybe I can give a reasonably brief answer, and that is, we spend a lot of time coming to fora like this, talking about the prospects for Africa. Is Africa rising? There's always the tendency to, being economists, to just assume away some of the, irritating facts that a lot of people may be getting left behind, even when you do see the solid headline growth rates. One of the big issues facing the region, and this applies across the board, to just about any of the countries that we focus on. So any of what we call the so-called frontier economies, which are on the cusp of becoming something even bigger, emerging markets, they're of interest to investors. These are the ones that are able to issue euro bonds in international markets. They're the ones that get the lion's share of investment. There's always a tendency to say, and this is not without substance, the growth, if it's going to happen on a global level, will have to come from Africa. If you're looking at global demographic trends, there isn't anywhere else that stands within sight of creating the kind of consumer class, the kind of consumer base that you're likely to see in Africa because of the demographic growth. We don't pay enough attention to what is actually happening in terms of the formalization of economies, what is actually happening in terms of job creation, whether we are seeing the rise of labor-intensive industries, and probably more on the creative side rather than the security side. Incidentally, and here's an anecdote, you're absolutely right in thinking if there is employment creation, it is actually that security guard industry that is creating more jobs, that is probably the largest employer in terms of the formal sector jobs growth across the region. That is precisely something that we should be worried about because of what it suggests in terms of inequality. So I probably can't give you a great answer to the question about different models and alternative to capitalism. I'd have to be too creative as an economist. But what I will say is we shouldn't take anything for granted. Africa does have the building blocks. Individual African countries absolutely do have what it takes for transformation to happen. They've got the building blocks for solid economic growth. But it's not going to be a given. It's not as though there are other alternatives that we can safely rule out. And this is why we do need to pay attention to the institutions that are in place, what is happening in terms of those resources, and perhaps be a little bit less forgiving of the lost years. When countries go into a slump, when newly elected governments end up disappointing, despite all the great fanfare and the expectations, when the formal sector job creation really isn't happening, when financial intermediation isn't happening as effectively as it should, these are lost opportunities, but the human cost is even more significant. So yes, we do need different models, we do need more labor-intensive models, we do need actual job creation to go with the headline growth, and no, it's not very easy to think of many countries in the region that are achieving this, or even one.
Seashells.
A small country.
So I just wanted to build on what Razia said, because I think there's one big challenge we have, and that is when we talk about growth and we talk about consumer-driven growth, we are forgetting the planetary limits within which we are operating, right? So, for example, there's a book by a guy called Lorenzo Fiomonte called GDP, Gross Domestic Problem, the world's most powerful number. So the way we measure growth is fundamentally flawed. Yes. So, for example, in, say, the Democratic Republic of Congo or the Cameroon, if we knock down, tons and tons of acres of forests, as far as GDP is concerned, it's put on the positive side of the equation. There are lots of things in terms of the climate realities that we face right now. It's the way the growth model is completely flawed, right? And we're stuck with that, though. It's not easy to present an alternative, but we need to acknowledge it and look for alternatives. The second thing we have to acknowledge is the biggest disease we have in the world today is not HIV/AIDS, it's not tuberculosis, it's not influenza, it's a disease we could call affluenza. And affluenza, I would say, is a pathological illness where people have come to realize or come to believe that a good, decent, happy, prosperous life comes from more and more and more material acquisitions. If we don't break that logic, if we don't, and this is why I love, the contribution about being, what you all introduced. It's exactly right. We have to redefine what it means to be human. We have been taken down a route where, and let's be honest, all of us are contaminated by affluenza. Even the poor, right, are suffering from the disease. because they've been led to believe that the only way you have meaning in life is to acquire more and more. And I'll just conclude by Davos and what I said there this last week. So when the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the contagion that came from it globally, when the global financial crisis happened in 2008, right? What was the response of the powerful? What was the response of the people that go to Davos, the CEOs of the big companies? It was system recovery, system protection, system maintenance. Even though what 2008 told us, that we have a dysfunctional economic system with bankers who are better called banksters, like gangsters, right, who are supposedly too big to fail and too powerful to jail, right, ran roughshod over working people's pensions in the UK, in the US, and elsewhere, and so on. And what was needed from our economic elites now is not system protection, system maintenance. It should be system redesign, system innovation, and system transformation. So while I don't know what the solution is to a post-capitalist economy, I can tell you that there are people, young people in particular, who are working to looking for new models, and I think we need to be supporting the search for new economic thinking, from the small scale to the big scale. And if we think that all is needed right now is to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic while humanity is sinking, then we are as culpable of being flawed in our thinking and flawed in courage as those we seek to criticize who hold power in the political and economic spheres.
I would be remiss, yes, not to, thank you. We need to get to you, but I also have to come back to Patrick, and it would be remiss of me not to give Razia the floor once more if you wanted to respond to that, because I asked you the question, and as a journalist, it'd be right of reply. You need
Let's
to
give Patrick a chance.
Okay. Nicely swerved, dodged there. Nice. Okay. Patrick, I know, of course, to this question of you've been talking about sort of decolonizing and all this language that perhaps actually in recent times we have heard coming up more from creative and cultural spaces than we've previously done. So maybe you want to speak to some of the things that have already been said. But, use the example of Namibia. Okay. When you were talking there about what was going on, it made me think of the expression, the banality of evil, just how mundane, terrible things are, and how actually we therefore need the arts and culture to reawaken us to actually what we're losing and what we could be gaining. Okay. What does that look like on the ground in one small country that we keep ignoring, Namibia?
Well, Namibia is very interesting in that sense, just because what I want to kind of embed in is the culture of the world. I think the culture of how we do things. And when we talk about culture, it's primarily, either a way of life or an expression of the way of life. So it's really encapsulated within that. So I think for the African spirit, I think one of the things that I love about being African is that this idea of like multiplicity. All right, so like people will be like, how do you speak 4 languages? And you're like, like you just and then somebody in Britain is just like, I can't even say hola español. It's just there's this huge dynamic, and I kind of get it because here it's cold. You have 9 months in the cold, and you don't have a lot of negotiation time. So you have to establish a certain truth in the most efficient and cost-effective manner. So I guess
there's a lot of casually throwing shade going on.
No, but it's a duality because I think it works here, right? I think that culture works here, but I don't think it works in a place where even just the weather, it's 41 degrees, and then you want me to work 8 hours, 8 to 5. The structure is not the same. So you'll see in African villages, people wake up a lot earlier. By 11 o'clock, you are done. So when you talk about models, I think that we're losing principles in the technicality. The principle is we have to rehumanize institutions. We have to rehumanize our conscience. We have to rehumanize our spirit. It's a rehumanization process that is critical because, to be honest, the colonialism benefited nobody. It didn't benefit you. It gave you what you're talking about, this affluenza that right now, the laws of diminishing return has got a backlash for people who are institutionally and systemically in the habit of benefiting from oppression and colonialism. And all of a sudden, there has been greater mobility on the other blind spot that you didn't see for coming because your intention was to break the spirit, but the spirit is unbreakable. So it can grow in that crack of concrete. You know, so for me, when this thing comes, it's really an idea that good seeds don't grow in bad soil, but bad seeds grow in good soil. So whether we're looking at institutions or personalities or legislation or policy, I'll give you the Namibian example, is we're really using the creative industry to make a high-stakes argument that this is something that's going to save you as a legitimate state because of this possibility and the duality of these young people posing a threat, or we being able to turn it into an opportunity that's efficient and cost-effective.
Let's open to the floor. You have been very patient. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. I wish I wasn't in this position.
Can I just say one thing before you cross over?
Sure.
It's very important for me. It's very important. And I think because it's like a tug of war, right? Like between this like duality thing. But we need critical mass, right? So mobilization becomes a huge factor. And when we talk about internet and technology and networks, Africa, we're talking about value chains in the creative industry. So if we're talking about an idea of employment, I think we have to raise the stake to well-being. So this is how automation works for us really well. We have a big skill deficit. We don't have infrastructure. We don't have necessarily financing that goes into mobilizing or being the fuel for these sectors. Now, we have the resource. We have the primary resource. Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, we have diamonds, for instance. But historically, our diamonds were exported to London. Because why? In London, they're creative. They know how to turn that into a nice crown and to a nice watch. And, you know, you can't possibly do that in Africa. You can only mimic, you know. So there are fundamental questions about what do you think about the ability of an African? Do you know anything about it? We need critical mass. And this is part of what's important in mobilization. So it's not just a conversation. It's about how does this conversation, how do you take it back into the spaces where you exist? How do you penetrate your households? How do you penetrate your family groups, your friendships, your workspaces, on the subway? Can you just look and acknowledge somebody? What happens? Because it's a million little things that end up having this cumulative effect where we are becoming more dehumanized and desensitized, and therefore we aren't having sensory experiences that are heightened. And the creative industry saves 3 birds with 1 stone. You're saying about killing the planet, killing people, killing prosperity. The creative industry saves those 3 things. It deals with our identity as culture. It deals with society's well-being. And it ultimately deals with giving you the cheapest economic intervention for young Africans that don't have any other access or opportunity or mobility. That's why we're important.
Amen and amen. Okay. The offering baskets will be coming round for collection in the Church of Patrick Sam. Okay.
That's a serious thing.
A very serious thing. I'm direct debits only. Okay, I see hands already. I'm going to take a few at once. We have about 20 minutes. So please make your questions succinct. And a question. Did I tell you there were drinks afterwards? So that if you want to shoot the breeze about the last book you read, please do that while we are enjoying refreshments together. So please ask a question. Ideally, put your question to one panelist so that we don't lose time trying to figure out how many different people can speak to that issue. Panelists, I implore you to do the same. Be succinct in your replies so that we can take as many of them as possible. Okay, can we start here at the front, please? And then also, because I'm biased like this, women, I know you're thinking many thoughts. You never put your hands up. Don't embarrass me today, please. There was one. I see it. So we will come to that. But let's start with the gentleman at the front and move our way back.
Okay, Jambo Njala. I forgive you, I'm Nigerian. My question is directed to Razia. Last year, there were over 200 billion.
I told you,
Ghana has better jollof.
Nigerian jollof rice is better than Kenyan jollof rice. We know that.
Right.
Last year, there was over $200 billion of aid fund, development finance, that went, generated globally. More than half of that went to Africa. In connecting the dot, there are schools of thought that believe that that money is creating a dependency, speaking to what you're talking about earlier on, Patrick. But others believe that that money just goes a roundabout, goes into Africa and out again, and it's not being used in the right way. What are your thoughts on it? How can we structure aid fund better? Some think it's about aid for trade, but it's still not done consistently. What can we do differently?
Thank you. If you pass the mic to the lady in the middle behind you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much. That was a really interesting combination of speakers. All of you referenced in some way Ethiopia, Angola, and there's so many sort of things we could draw from that, where transition comes from, does it always come from ruling parties, etc. But one of the things that really comes up on the Ethiopian example, which is now relevant for what's happening in Sudan, is what it showed about the different new, well, maybe they're not new, but we didn't pay attention, the new players on the continent in the Horn. So this sort of Saudi, Emirati axis versus the Turkey, Qatar axis. And I'm wondering what you think about that, given that yes, change has to come from within, but for this protest movement in Sudan to succeed, those countries need to move. And then very quickly, you said the West isn't coming for us anymore. Can we talk also about our region, thinking of DRC and the terrible ending to that story?
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, the gentleman there, please. We're going to work our way back and to the sides.
Ms. Khan, what are the prospects of Britain improving trade with Africa post-Brexit?
Okay, well, you've let off a bomb there. To this side, are there any? No? Okay, can you come over to this side and then we'll move to the back. We'll take the front. There's a hand right here, please.
Hi, this question is for Patrick. I am in London this year doing my master's, and I plan to write my dissertation about the topic of arts and development. And I think I'm at LSE, and one of the big pushbacks I'm getting from my department is this view that the arts are somehow a luxury, and that arts and culture are a luxury that come after, more core survival aspects of development. So how do we shift that perspective?
Don't ask white people. Okay, legitimate question. Right, we have 4 speakers. Oh, there's a hand. Yes, hello.
So I'm the North African, so I'm always forgotten also in these. So as you get from my question, it's about North African space in Africa. Are we going to see finally more North Africans on these types of panels? And not only I think, honestly, I don't know who to address the question to, because financially and economically, yes, we see that there's a bit of North Africa's face turning to sub-Saharan Africa, but I'm interested in the more cultural and identity questions about this.
I would like to suggest that perhaps that is a question for the Royal African Society. Can we make sure we find some North African panelists? But also, I think for the longest time, North Africa, for all the advantages of both skin and economic connections, we're very happy to look north of the water. So, yes. No, it is mixed, but I'm noticing that culturally there is far more interest, for example, hosting the first climate change talks so I was just, because there are only 4 of you, so, okay. Can I divvy up the questions? I think there was one to you, Patrick. There was a specific one to you. Would you like to take the first one on development finance, perhaps? How do you feel about that one and rearranging all the power players?
Sure.
Okay.
So...
No, fine. Let's start with you and then we work our way down.
Okay, so thank you. Very important question. Let's just note a few things. The amount of money that comes in terms of conventional aid to Africa is minuscule when you talk about the amount of money that comes from the African diaspora into the homes of people which matter. You should look at the old question of remittances and how critically important they are for local economies. But when we look at the flows of money, I don't have a current statistic on this, I apologize. But I know when I was the chair of the global part of Make Poverty History a couple of years ago, at that time our stat was for every $1 that was flowing into Africa, $8 was flowing out in terms of, recuperation of profits and also much more nefarious flows of money. So I would just say to anybody who's interested in getting involved in this, there is a civil society campaign on the continent. It's called Stop the Bleeding campaign, right? And this comes out of, by the way, this is like one of the few areas where African governments and African civil society are united. Yeah, there's not that many, sadly, right? But this is one area where we are united in the sense that our governments rail against this. Thabo Mbeki chaired a panel, you might remember, on this question of illicit financial flows. There's a whole report on it. But overall, I think we have to move towards a view that we cannot be enslaved in our mentality to constantly thinking that forever and ever we need to be dependent on aid, right? We have to make a breakthrough out of it. However, I do think the issue, the one area of finance that we need to think slightly differently about, and that is the area of the green finance and the green climate fund that we fought very hard to get out of the climate negotiations. Because I just want to be clear about when people in countries of the global south and all African countries in that group are asking for the Green Climate Fund to have sufficient money to support poor countries to make their transitions and not to follow the same dirty energy pathways that rich countries built their economies on and so on. This is something, as far as, say, for Africa, we're not asking for charity. We are simply saying, pay your carbon debt. This is the issue of climate justice. And what we are saying is that for all the, because you know now, like for example, Bolsonaro is saying, you'll want us to keep our forests. You'll say the Amazon is the lung of the planet. You folks in the north destroyed your forests because of your economy and built your economies. You know, I mean, to the leaders who say that, we have to be saying to them in the global south, you cannot bury your head in the sand and say just because people in the north did it, we also have to do it, even if it means destroying our children's futures. So there needs to be a bit more bolder thinking about revenue. And I would like to say what Patrick has done, which is so valuable for our conversation here, is to look at new ways of generating value. You know, we need to not be locked into the current mode. If we think that all that is going to get us to where we need to do is incremental changes with the current economic realities we face, then I think we are being delusional. We need fundamental change, and if we can have a kind of, leapfrogging like we did with the cell phones instead of landlines, that would be great. But I think for those Africans in the audience, and all of you in the audience, who are doing economics and doing topics like what we've heard, I would say be bold in your thinking. Don't be restricted by the status quo. And since you're not going to ask me to answer that, I just want to say that to my sister from North Africa, Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity, which is driven by young people, it's one of the principles was that we want to unite the entire African continent. So there are lots of young people from North Africa that are actively involved in the leadership and the staff and so on. Go online, join, become part of it, because I don't think North African civil society should be blamed because the leaders in the political leadership in North Africa want to swing both ways, meaning that when it suits them, they want to be African. When it doesn't suit them, they want to be, European. Part of MENA and Middle East and North Africa. So, I mean, I think when we talk about Pan-Africanism, North African peoples are part of the Pan-African reality. And what's great is young people in North Africa want to be part of a united African continent, and we should embrace that, I believe.
Okay.
I'm gonna like marathon this.
Yeah, please. So, having to retract the props I gave Kumi for being succinct before.
Ethiopia. The interesting thing is, I went to Sudan and Ethiopia very close together. So I was in Sudan in February, and then I was in Ethiopia I was in Ethiopia in February, and then I was in Sudan in April. And I remember leaving both countries at the time, military regimes, both countries at the time authoritarian, both with very young populations, both with a long history of, everything that there's so much. If there are any two countries that I felt in Africa at that time were almost identically structured, it was Sudan and Ethiopia. And both have come to the same point. Both of them have run out of money and have been forced to make key political decisions. Bashir is resisting. He will have to eventually. But Ethiopia, people don't realize, because they're very good at controlling information, how information flows in and out of the country, that Ethiopia ran out of money some time ago, and that the level of state violence against Ethiopian people was so much worse than what we were seeing in the press. And I remember leaving at the end of this period thinking Ethiopia was going to break first, because Sudanese people were not afraid. They were done being afraid of Bashir. And they were out in the streets every day, every week. People were daring the state to arrest them, daring the state to push them, daring the state to come and get us because we are done. The Sudan protests have been going pretty much since 2013. But the difference is people care about what happens in Ethiopia. Very few people seem to care about what's happening in Sudan. And I think that on one hand, as I mentioned before, one of the great things that's happened is this rise of networked protesting, that we're seeing Sudanese people actually documenting and actually telling their story regardless of whether or not because there isn't a lot of international media in Sudan, and the little that is there is being deported, is having work permits canceled and things like that. And so Sudanese people are saying, look at us, we're here, we're doing these things in a way that we didn't necessarily see with Ethiopia, because so many Ethiopians had already left by that time. But I do think that despite all of these, I hesitate to encourage intervention in Sudan. And it sounds paradoxical, because that tends to be the line of thinking that we say, there's a problem here, someone help, who is someone, blah, blah, blah. And the reason I say that is I don't see any country right now, any international quote-unquote power, whatever that means, right now that has the interests of Sudanese people at heart. But the second part of your question, I think, answers that, which is, what about a regional intervention? And what would a regional intervention look like? And it's interesting to me that the AU has been so quiet on Sudan. And it's interesting to me that right now, as Bashir is arresting students and detaining people and doing all of this stuff, the AU is hosting peace talks in the Central African Republic in Khartoum. What does that say about what the AU thinks about what's happening in Sudan? So, long story short, I do think that this is a chance for the AU to actually prove itself, but based on what just happened in the DRC, I'm not holding my breath for it. I think it should be encouraged. I think leaving it to Qatar and Saudi Arabia is going to, and even the United States or the EU, the EU is not interested in Sudan or Sudanese people, is interested in stopping migration from Sudan. They don't care what happens to Sudanese people. These are things that we need to grapple with. Blitzing. I've got one more that I wanted to answer, just one more. The last thing I wanted to answer was about the North African question. I think Kumi touched on this, and I think it's important to distinguish the interests of North African elites from the interests of North African people. Egypt was a founding member of the Organization of African Union, of African Unity. The Western Sahara has been embedded in the AU since forever. There's the connections between Algeria and liberation movements in West Africa is really deep. And for better or worse, there's definitely a lot of worse. So was Libya, deeply embedded in freedom movements in West Africa. So we need to shift that paradigm a little bit. These categories, Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa except South Africa, are created for the convenience of Western analysts. They're not created for the benefits of African people. They're created by people who studied Arabic and want to be able to work in Bahrain as well as Morocco, as well as whatever, without having to justify that shifting thing in the same way that they can say, well, I did my work in Zambia, so therefore I'm an expert in Burkina Faso because Zambians are black and Burkina Faso people are black, and therefore it's the same thing. So I think as an analyst, as you grow in your own, decolonization is a project that's very close to my heart, and it's something that I try to do in all of the work that I do. And I hope that people who read my work see this, is that it functions on two levels. Number one is the substantive work, but number two is trying to test out these ideas of what does it look like to think about Africa as a continent and not sub-Saharan Africa except South Africa. And I would challenge you to do the same in your own thinking, is that there is going to be a lot of resistance to this. But if we don't test it out, we can never hold up the example and say, actually, there's a different way of thinking about these things.
Thank you. You do it to yourself. Razia, please.
So, super quick responses. Yes. First of all, aid dependency. It's not something that any African economy really needs to be worrying about. If we look at this in macro terms, there is less per capita going to the region. The amount of aid that you see in terms of the share of the government budget is getting smaller and smaller. This has been a secular trend. It's unlikely to change anytime soon. And maybe that is a problem, because compared to all of the capital flows that are available to African economies, the one that does have an explicit pro-poor motivation, or should have much more of an explicit pro-poor motivation, is specifically the ODA. If that is not coming through, there may be other forms of capital inflows, but they are there for other reasons. And this is something that we do need to give more thought to. On the question about Britain improving trade with anywhere post-Brexit, or improving trade with Africa, if we look at the overall data, actually, the UK has been losing trade share with Africa quite dramatically for some time. Again, this looks like a trend that isn't necessarily going to be easily reversed. Maybe without the shackles of whatever the EU agreements were, we will see a different UK emerging, or maybe that really requires a lot of imagination. So, from an economist's perspective, what we do see right now is uncertainty, and that traditionally has not been the way to foster greater global trade. This isn't only with reference to Brexit, it is with reference to all the trade tensions globally, where wherever supply chains have been built, wherever there has been closer integration, the real threat to future prosperity is that if we can't take that for granted, what does the outlook look like?
That's brilliant. Lastly, Patrick.
When I grow up, I want to be like Razia. I think, getting back to your question, it's interesting for me when they've invited me to the State House, and they're like, Patrick, come talk about arts and culture. And then the presidential advisor was like, I'd like to introduce the art and culture guy there. And I said, I hope it's the last time in an economic meeting you referred to us as that. Can we please just establish it's called the culture and the creative industries? Okay. They were like, okay, that sounds serious. Let's talk economics. But I think there's this idea, right, in what Chimamanda spoke about years ago, the danger of the single story. Right, so like this idea of the intersection between poverty and pleasure. So you can't talk about Africans having pleasure while all these things are happening. Like, well, how are you guys busting it down when there's wars and there's weapons being moved and, there's a lot going, there's a lot at stake here. But I think, again, this is like quantum and this metaphysical space but innately we have kind of not appropriated, right? So when the university says you can't go look at art and culture because it's an idea of luxury, it's not true, because the pleasure economy is a key pillar that drives all the other economies. In for instance, Britain, in 1998, they did a study around the value of the creative industries, right, in London or in the UK generally. And because it's not studied, and I think greatly it'll be interesting to look at the informal sector and how that is actually the driver and the sustainability for people's livelihoods currently, when these systems and these states and these multinationals are still extorting these things. How do you have this level of resilience while these risks exist? Right? And I think the power lies there. Because if we're looking at who owns the most of the world's wealth, right, where the resources are, the way that we are going to then reappropriate that and talking about this different reality, if you're going to look at the means of production with its labor, capital, enterprise, technology, you'll see that it's hugely skewed against Africa. But if you're looking at pleasure, and if you're looking at culture, I mean, in South Korea, people are doing hip-hop like it's out of fashion. The black culture is used as a custodian of popular culture. But the same way that our resources don't benefit the African people, even our attitudes don't benefit us. Right? It's crazy. Like, I watch K-pop. I'm infatuated with K-pop because I just don't understand. Like, how can Chinese people dance better than me? How can Korean people dance better than me? How can Japanese people dance? Like, I didn't have that growing up. But I think it's important to understand and to decolonize this idea that in the midst of poverty, there is no pleasure. That's not true, precisely because of duality, precisely because these spectrums and these things happen in ways that we can't imagine them. So to close up, I think it's important to decolonize that, to deconstruct that, bring more nuance, be meticulous about what you understand about what actually prevails on the ground, to say that the people want pleasure and there's an economy, and that's why I said, let's monetize this. Because as long as I'm dancing for free, you're happy about it. But if I put a price on it, you're like, no, but you didn't get trained in the National Theatre. But I've been dancing, right? I mean, this city is sustained by art and culture. There's a huge economic benefit. The trickle-down even works best if it doesn't work generally. It works the best in art and culture because you don't need the systemic, if the education system fails, you don't need that, right? You already have the skill, you have the art. Let's invest, let's take you to scale, and let's sustain you.
I'm trying to catch the eye of people with more power than myself to know whether or not I should brave a second round. I think it's only fair that we do, because we have another sort of 5 or so minutes. So panelists, work with me here. Okay, so can we start with, to be fair, let's do the second half of the room. I apologize, just because otherwise it won't be fair to the people who had their hands up at the back and were waiting patiently for me to work back. Okay, can we start with the lady here, and then if we have time, we'll come back and take yours too. Thank you.
As I'm in an academic space, I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I'm the person on the street. I'm the African you're talking about who is not, if you want, in economics or in political analysis. So I'm asking for the children of Africa. When I listen to you as Africans speaking, it resonates. I can take the negative things you say and I can see the positive things you say, and I don't feel offended by them or annoyed by them. It's you describing me, right? I don't want my 3-year-old niece to wait until she's in the 5th decade of life. How do we get your message to our children so they grow up with this self-awareness that I seek, that are found here, and they don't have to wait until they go to university? I want her at 10 to have the self-awareness you speak of.
Okay, can we, if you work your way up this way? Yes, the lady here, and then we'll work our way back.
Thank you. I'm Ditiro Makhatlela from South Africa. My question is on the economic side of things, that we're talking about this free trade deal. And I'm wondering if this is really a viable solution for us as a continent. Because I'm asking myself, what is it that our countries are producing and what is it that we're consuming? And if that's going to flow around between the different countries. As a Pan-African, obviously, the idea wins for me. But I'm just wondering on the practical side, what is going to be the challenges and the reality actually of whether or not that's actually viable, looking at what we're producing versus what is being consumed.
Thank you. Let's take a couple from the side, please. There are a couple of hands. Yes, if you just work, if you head to the back, the gentleman up there, we'll take that one too.
Thank you. My name is Kolawole Olani. I'm from Nigeria, but I work for Amnesty International here in London. I have...
But your boss is just...
Yeah, my boss is over there, so absolutely.
He's been planted.
Shabi, you can ask this question around coffee in the office.
He's been planted.
He's declaring his allegiances here now.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I have 2 small questions, and I have actually 2 small comments, and I have questions.
Please.
The first comment.
To your guy.
the first comment is, I think it is high time Africa stop blaming outsider for its problems, because after over 5 decades after independence, I think Africa has to take responsibility and has to take ownership for its own progress, problem, and achievement. So what I say is that Africa has got to man up, grow up, and take responsibility. That's number one. The second one
is your last. Can you ask the question?
Yeah, the second one is,
thank you.
I see a paradox here. There are 3 of the biggest strengths of Africa: culture, wealth, population. Paradoxically, it seems to be the 3 of the biggest threats to Africa. My question is this: can we sort Africa without sorting out all of these 3? For example, culture, we have a culture that historically marginalizing women. We have a culture that promotes corruption by way of gift giving. I mean, there used to be a president in Nigeria who says that stealing is not corruption. So how do we resolve that? And we know that most of the countries in Africa that are conflict-ridden are countries with oil wealth, all production and all of that. So how do we resolve Africa without actually resolving all of this typology? And the final one, I heard one of the panelists.
It would be totally unfair of me to allow you to continue, please.
Just a few seconds, please.
No, it would just because we are over time.
Yeah, we're over time.
And we have a few more. But you have made both a great point and a good question, which is 50% more than everyone else got.
Excellent.
So
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Let me take that hand in the corner. Thank you for being gracious.
Hi, thanks. I have a very quick question for Patrick. In your vision of rehumanization, how do you see the role of Christianity, or more broadly, religion? Or is religion also an imperial category?
Such a university question. There has to be that one.
I got you. Yeah, no, this is the end. No, we'll come back here. So, yeah, I will. So what we were scheming up here is that if we just hear the last few questions from this corner, then in answering them, the panelists will make their concluding remarks as well, so that we tie it all in together. It's the only way. But yes, if you start with so I'm counting 4. No more. Starting with the gentleman here and then finishing with the gentleman at the back.
Hello, I'm Roman. I'm a strategic director for one of European universities. It happened to me last year to spend 2 months in Kenya, so jumbo from me. You are saying that, West is not coming. Well, actually, we went to Kenya to carry out some kind of research project and returned with probably the biggest startup in the world. So it's being developed and bright future in front of Africa, in front of Kenya, I must admit. Thank you.
Okay. Can those 4, there's the lady, yeah, and then the gentleman there.
I've got a question for Patrick. You talk about decolonizing arts and culture, which I think is important, but there's one obvious thing when I think about arts and culture, let's say, from being a Nigerian, is that a lot of our artifacts from the Kingdom of Benin and such are in the UK and they will not let it go. So I'm trying to figure out how are we meant to decolonize it when the West, they have our artifacts, they won't give it back, and they also seem to control what is considered art and culture. You gave a good example about K-pop. When they were doing hip-hop in, I don't know, Baltimore, Chicago, that was considered ghetto, but then the minute they took it over to UK or Japan or whatnot, suddenly it was a culture that could be monetized. So I don't know how we meant to decolonize it when we don't even have our things back.
Okay, the gentleman at the far left there. Can you pass the mic down to him, please? You're right.
Hi there. I've got a question, Will van Merwe from South Africa. I've got a question for Nanjala. It seems like there's an overriding theme of exploitation. And obviously that's inherited from the past, but we're at the current state. And the exploitation is by our own leaders in Africa, by China, and by international organizations, wittingly or unwittingly, or intentionally and unintentionally, that maintain the status quo. For people in Africa, in countries, it can be difficult. When you're a fish, you don't realize that there's water around. So I would say in this hall, we've got a whole lot of expats that have actually got a privilege of understanding and knowing how things work in Africa, in our home countries, and also having networks. And we've also got a knowledge of how the international system works. So this is an incredibly powerful group. What would you say that that the expats in this group, what should we be doing to make a difference? Because something needs to change.
Very good question. And the last question at the back. Can you just pass the mic back to the handout? Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to try to make this very simple. I'm just interested in the private sector and its role for organic African growth and to contribute in building greater welfare for the population. Because we've seen a lot of African venture capitalist firms, for example, that are on the rise, and there's a very strong entrepreneurial spirit in Kenya and in Uganda and other places with, for example, a company called Good African Coffee from Uganda that enabled to start exporting to international markets. So I'm just curious about what role do you see the private sector and entrepreneurialism, and also what are the limits to these young African entrepreneurs for them to enter the international markets and bring meaningful job creation to communities?
All right, thank you. That little note that came round said each of our panelists has a minute, not a symbolic minute, not a Kenyan minute.
I'm going to time myself.
A God-true minute. 60 seconds. Let's start with you, Patrick.
And end with me? I want to be artistic about the end.
You want to be artistic at
All
the
right,
end?
I'll start.
We don't have time to negotiate.
In the interest of art.
We're expecting some pirouetting
Yeah.
In your final remarks.
Okay, in the interest of artistic talent. So I just want to pick up the question about blame, right? So let me say to the leaders on the African continent, if you are denying gender equality, if you are engaging in corruption, if you are engaging in repression against your own people, you cannot use history for that, right? You got to take responsibility. So in that sense, I think, let's be very clear, you cannot blame colonialism for locking up your people and shooting your people and denying things that are within your domain of control. Having said that, I think it's very clear that there are a range of injustices that are built in the structural economy of the world that we live. There are legacies from colonialism that are alive and well and kicking in our arts, in our culture, in our economy. So while on the one hand, we say as African civil society to our leaders on the continent, we'll stand shoulder to shoulder with you and fight for trade justice and a fair global trading system and so on. Because those things are the spillover from the colonial era and the continued domination of the economy by a handful of powerful countries in the world. But on the other side, we say, don't come and tell us that because of colonialism, you want to deny women full access to the economy, that because of colonialism, you throw people in jail and so on. That's my concluding comment. Thank you. And I stayed within a minute.
I'm going to take the second half of Kumi's minute.
I was thinking.
He's not using it, so I'm going to take it.
Creative accounting with minutes here.
I'm going to tie two things together, which is how do we get this information to people and how do we challenge the whole exploitation paradigm that's on the ground? And to me, it comes down to the same thing. It's knowledge. And you know, as Kenyans, for example, they've been experimenting on Kenyan children for the last 2 years, trying out different education systems and then going, oh, well, oops, that's bad. Let's do it again. And what you see overall is that there is no philosophy. There is no critical thinking behind these education paradigms. They're all neoliberal, like we need to produce workers. We need to produce people who will be, you know, productive in the simplistic neoliberal way. And so what we're saying is, can we start, I think it starts with education. I think it really starts with rethinking what we think about knowledge and what we think about knowledge of ourselves and doing it. And like I said, I try to make my work function on two levels. I try to make it work on a substantive level and to work on a philosophical, broader level. And that is, number one, when you write a book, launch it in Kenya. Talk to people in Kenya. Do events in Kenya. It means going to public spaces and making it available to Kenyans. It means resisting this neoliberal capture, I would say, of who we think we are. Africans don't just exist to be labor. We're not just labor. We're not just potential productivity. We're actual human beings who exist now, today, and need to have all of these other things in order to have a well-rounded existence. So I just wanted to tie those two things together because I think that they're connected. Should we stop? That phrase, man up. I just wish every man knew what life was like when you actually have a uterus and ovaries, because then you would really think that man up is just like the worst thing to say. But can we just think about the fact that colonization lasted for more than the 50 years that we're talking about today. There are many people who are alive today who suffered from the apartheid regimes that we saw in Nairobi, in Eldoret, in South Africa, in Namibia, in Botswana, and they're still alive. And a friend of mine, we were driving through Cape Town, and we were going through Cape, there's a neighborhood in Cape Town, I forget, and she was like, oh, that used to be my family home, but we were pushed out in 1967 to make room for the white neighborhood that came up later. So it's not a question of, colonialism is not ancient history. It's stuff that we still live with today, and we have to be realistic about that. And I think also, yeah, I'm just gonna stop there because I'm gonna start preaching. In terms of marginalization of women, I think I will have to check the final statistic, but I believe that over 60% of the small and medium enterprises in Kenya are owned by women. I think that more businesses in Africa are owned by women. The thing is, we think entrepreneurship is Elon Musk. We think entrepreneurship is Mark Zuckerberg. We think innovation is an app. And the reality is, the vast majority of entrepreneurs are people that we constantly talk about in disempowering terms. It is women who are founding small businesses. It is people with disabilities who are thinking about creative ways of navigating hostile cities. It is people who are, the elderly who are thinking of new ways of including their grandchildren who have been abandoned, who their families cannot provide for, taking them into their homes and thinking about new ways of thinking about community and inclusion and belonging. And so we have to reframe ourselves again. What does the world look like when the central referent object of your analysis is not a white man? That is what we need to be thinking about. When people this is the problem that I've always had with startup culture in Nairobi. I'm trying. This is the problem I've always had with startup culture in Nairobi, is that people think that because Ushahidi started in 2007, that entrepreneurship in Kenya started in 2007, when the fact is there are more entrepreneurs in Kenya coming up business. So how do we create a climate that is good for those business people as well, for the mama mboga, for the people who are selling vegetables? And the fundamental question I think you have to ask yourself, if you are the person who wants to come in, is start with, how can I help? Don't come in with, I know, and therefore I'm here to tell you. This is a problem with civil society. This is a problem with business. This is a problem with anybody who thinks Africa doesn't need people to save. We don't need saviors. We need partners. And to be a partner means to begin with centering the other person's experience and asking, what can I do to help you? This is a fundamental thing that we're lacking. I'm gonna wrap up. I'm landing. Here it comes. The plane is landing. The plane is landing. The last point I wanted to comment on was actually on the climate change issue, and it ties in with the whole idea of the West isn't coming. There's a program in Kenya, there's an initiative called Economies, and it's against, people of Lamu Island who are organizing against a coal plant that's being built that is a first-generation coal plant. The technology is bad, it's going to poison, it's going to ruin the economy, etc. You should look it up. But the point that I wanted to make with Save Lamu is really it highlights all of these paradoxes that we're talking about today, because the number one, the organization, the design, everything is a Chinese company that's funding it. General Electric is providing the technology for it. The Kenyan government has greenlit it. When the Lamu organizers organized to try and resist the coal plant, the day before the hearing, because you have to have these environmental hearings because the law says you do, they moved the hearing to a remote place where they knew people wouldn't have access to transport. When I was researching this story to write an article about it, I called the National Environmental Agency, and the guy literally hung up on me. Like, I called him 5 times, and he literally would hang up. And I said, I tried to give them the right of reply, and he spent the whole time running away from me. When we talk about these things in aggregate, in bigger picture things, it's easy to get lost in the abstraction and to think that what we're saying on this panel is feel-good theoretical Foucauldian deconstruction shit. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I meant it, though. But the reality of these things is power, the reality of what power looks like on a day-to-day basis is Lamu, is ordinary people who are doing everything that we're praising here, who are organizing, who are resisting, who are pushing back, and are coming up against embedded systems from which the people in this room benefit. General Electric is a large multinational corporation that is listed on the stock exchanges of both the United States and I believe the United Kingdom as well. Why are we talking about the profit margins of these companies as if they are neutral, right? When the reality is they're going to kill people in Lamu. So for me, the paradigm shift, and I believe someone asked here about it's about the reality of bringing these things down, is taking stuff out of the theoretical realm and breaking it down into real-world examples and really tying it and trying to do things differently, which fundamentally begins with the question, how can we help?
Continental free trade area, very quickly, we all know the issues, not being ratified fast enough. The infrastructure to enable free trade isn't necessarily there yet. What we do know is that the infrastructure traditionally built has been very extractive. It's about commodities and out. It isn't about trading in. But if there's something that we've learned from Patrick this evening, it's that we all have the power to imagine something different and to do things differently. So yes, it's still a step in the right direction. It will be slow. It's not going to be an instant game changer. Very little ever is.
Thank you.
Okay, so on a serious matter, I think on the turn of the century from into the 20th century, there was the first biggest genocide before the Holocaust happened in Namibia. And a lot of what happened actually was rooted in the kind of pilot project of Namibia, the genocide of the Herero people, the idea around concentration camps, the idea of Lebensraum. All of these things were practiced in Namibia already at the genocide. Namibia has an act of parliament that says we want the German government to acknowledge, to accept, and then to pay reparations. We are 2 out of the 3 ways there. Now, recently there was a book commissioned called Genocide Gaze, and I think it's important in terms of how do we change the gaze that she argues. And she says part of the challenge of why the German populace, it's difficult to come to terms with the second genocide within such a short period of time, is because the idea of imperialism is celebrated in these societies. Right? We were great conquerors. We were intelligent. We were smarter than you. We were better. We knew a lot more of these things. So why are we going to pay for things? We civilized you. Right? And in there is the problem. That those acts of imperialism were actually barbaric. They were inhumane. They were uncivilized. And these societies for centuries benefited from them. Therefore, even if you talk about, for instance, the resources put behind something like an NHP, something that you love, where if you track those funds and when Panama Papers come out and when you're looking at the flow of money, you have to unlearn. We have to unlearn. There's an unconscious bias towards how we think about the world, the systems that perpetuate the inequality that exists, and it's not enough because it's a shameful act of the species that calls themselves the greatest, has the greatest inequality, can't get along in one room, has the greatest insecurities, is so fragile, is guilty of things that they didn't want to do, and it carries on. So the unlearning, and to answer the question that we can tie it into the religion, is really that imperialism is a thing that needs to be stopped celebrated. Those statues need to come down. It's important for all of our healing. The fear of loss around things that were not good around human development can no longer exist given the knowledge that we have. And this is to add to Nanjala's point of, yes, we've had the knowledge, but we have to create systems and we have to provide a service to people. Because not every opportunity is there for everybody, right? So it's important when you're talking about religion, and this helps being an African. Have you been to an African church? Yeah? Have you been there? You think it's like here, the church here? My friend, the church in Africa is embedded in praise and worship. So the idea of repackaging and upscaling religion works. But my point is, can we allow multiplicity to exist? So if people feel, given our constitution, our democratic freedoms, that I want to exercise religion, I don't think it's decolonized because we already decolonized it. We changed it. Yes. Already. Nigerian churches. I mean, what I want to get into the conversation is more around tax regimes. Exploitation of people who don't have access to other things. You know, we're talking about churches in terms of why they don't pay tax, because they used to have schools and hospitals. Now, in the absence of all of this human development infrastructure, we need to tax the church. Right? And then getting on to, just these multinationals. And you were asking the question about tax evasion and how much Africa losing billions of dollars in terms of capital outflight and not having enough institutional capacity and willingness and political will, because the sad thing is the people are somebody's benefiting from corruption. Right? And how are we, when you talk about power, going to deconstruct the people who are in power? Because it's kind of counterintuitive to say that you have the power, I don't, give it to me. But we have to therefore have a critical mass, because I think when we have a certain collective consciousness and we believe not just on Twitter in these things and become these Instagram activists that we have, or the social media activists, it's important that we actually walk the talk. And so in concluding, I want to say, I believe in a quote. I don't know who's it by. I'm not claiming, and I just read it somewhere. But it's not just changing the gaze, because we have things like intergenerational trauma, right? So we have to deal with the levels of things like sexual violence. We have to deal with issues around sexual reproduction for women, because if you look at mobility of women in the continent, it's directly tied to sexual reproduction rights. Right? So what does that mean in terms of for a rural girl accessing that and her education and the kind of intersectionality, but the nuances that are around this. So my kind of closing remark in a quote, before I do an extract of a poem of mine, that's how I'm going to close, is if we want things that we haven't had, we have to do things we haven't done. So you have to walk out of fear. And you have to go do that one thing that you've never done. Because it's counterintuitive to think that you're going to get better results if we keep on doing the same thing. It's actually insanity. Right? So you have to now commit. What action are you going to take that's different, that you haven't done yet, that you've feared? And that kind of shows the resilience factors in the social fabric of individuals. Right? And so I'm going to finish as an artist, as a writer and a poet, with just segments, about 4 stanzas of a poem that I most recently wrote. It's very short, né? So it goes. It goes. It's done. It's almost... I omitted my presence from these spaces because the love I received was too much to be contained by my heart. It superseded the love I had for myself, so naturally the vase overflowed. The content was filled with baggage from the past, no room for new intakes. The things I adapted newly flowed away while the past solidified in the cup. I was passed out, caught up, filled to the brim. I was committed to assisting the system that destroys the self. Like a child soldier, I held the rifle encountering civilians in these streets, these supposed people who only listen to shit that's broadcasted outside of themselves. All wisdom possessed within has become dispossessed and the inner voice silenced. So I stay in your eyes, anticipating to see streetlights, a shine so bright that even though they are apparent whispers of darkness, the light connects us. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, before like 2 full children, you go off and consume more of the brilliance that we've had, I just want to pass over to Tom Porter to say just a few words of thanks from the British Council, and then I'll let us just basically sit with the brilliance that we have all been part of today. But Tom.
Thank you, Eliza. And I've just been sent commiserations from my team to have to follow this. So. My name's Tom Porter. I'm Director of Arts for the Sub-Saharan Africa and the British Council, and I'm also 4 years into a 1-year MA here at SOAS. And I just really enjoy coming to events where who I am, what I do, and even my job title is highly problematic. So what I just want to quickly do before we go and have drinks and networking is recognise some of the team that we have that work on the ground in Africa for the British Council. So if you want to chat to them about what we do, you can speak to them. So we have a colleague from Nigeria, that's Ajoma. We also have Maria from Nigeria. We have Millicent and Mabel from Uganda. And Rocker, based in Kenya. So if you want to find out more about what we do, please come up to us in the drinks. Outside, there'll be some refreshments, and I look forward to taking the conversation forward. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you to Kumi, Razia, Nanjala, and Patrick, and to all of you for coming. See you this time next year. Enjoy.